because I don't want to spare any time delving into this critical race topic. So this presentation is going to explore critical race theory as an analytical tool to help change the trajectory, hopefully, of recruitment and retention for a more racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse student, staff, and faculty in higher education. CRT, which is sort of the acronym for critical race theory, is an applied theory that began during the 1970s by legal scholars such as Derek Bell, Delgado, Stefancic, Kimberly Crenshaw, and others. So as an analysis, as an analytical tool in higher education, what I decided to look into was specifically within MnSCU, what were some of the ways in which critical race theory can be applied to sort of look at why we have such systemic issues around retention, around recruitment, around matriculation into faculty and administrative positions, for instance, for faculty of color. And so what I found are several factors that problematize our experiences, both from even before we even get to the institution, while we're there in the institution, and while we're trying to do our work from all of those different perspectives. So let's get into it. Hopefully this works. So here's the essential question. So what tenets of critical race theory are showing up in your institution or in our institutions right now? And where do they show up? So when I begin to get into this research, those are the questions that I needed to ask in order to be able to apply critical race theory to address certain things that I would then be able to illuminate from things that I found in practice and in policy and in language. Okay? So to give you a perspective of this history of this particular applied theory, it's important to give a little background. Derek Bell, who many critical race theorists would consider to be the founding father of this particular idea, because it started in terms of legal scholarship and in the legal system. And his particular analysis of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 there was a central piece that he wrote in the Harvard Law Review to basically suggest that Brown versus Board didn't work. It has not worked, and it is not working. And what's critical in this is that people in education, particularly in my field, look at this as a landmark decision that is worth highlighting and celebrating in some cases. But Bell and others look at it as the point in which we sort of can spring off of and see why we have greater disparity today in achievement by African Americans primarily and other people of color than we did even then in some cases. So I will walk us through the basic tenets, and I'll give just little examples today for each one, just so you can get an idea of what this is all about. So the tenets are, and this is, by the way, these tenets, they change depending on who the scholar might be and who might be presenting. I come from an educational background, so a lot of what I talk about has to do with systemic issues within education. So these are the ones that I sort of use when I analyze a system. So racism is ordinary. I'll talk about that. Whiteness as property. Interest convergence. The social construct of race. Differential racialization. Intersectionality. And then finally, the critique of liberalism. These are the tenets that we'll break down one at a time now to sort of get inside of how they might work, how maybe you have been impacted by them if you consider some of the phenomena that I will try to explain. So let's talk about racism as ordinary. This is about systems. Okay? And in K-12 education, the systems are varied. So Blanchett in 2006, Noguera 2008, Kunjufu is also person to look into in terms of the scholarship that has been provided on one particular policy and or practice and or systemic problem, and that is the overrepresentation of particularly black males in special education. So, and as a corollary aspect, that means that there's an overrepresentation of whites in gifted and talented programs. And that makes a difference in terms of academic performance, graduation rates, suspension rates, and so forth. In fact, so emotional behavior disorder, for instance, is a label that is used primarily, again, overemphasizing black males in that particular categorization, even as early as first grade. And some of the data will show that once you get categorized as such, you don't get out. You remain in special ed, or you remain in emotional behavior disorder categories for the entirety of your K-12 career, and then going beyond. So then the research suggests that there's a relationship between students who are categorized with these labels and graduation rates, and then there are connections between graduation rates and prison incarceration. So you see, this is a system that is at work. And so critical race theory is able to use this particular analyses to try to point out some of these things. And so what you have to understand is that the ordinariness of it is because people who are in power can't see it. And sometimes people who are not in power can't see it. It has become ordinary. It's normalized. It's almost like an expectation that we have. That's the ordinariness of it. Let's talk about college admissions. I happen to know this past year, they happened to change some of the minimum GPA requirements, knowing that there's already a gap. So where students who are of color who may have met some criteria last year did not meet it this year in some institutions. So it further creates this gap. And it's not to say that we shouldn't have high expectations, but the point is that when the dial keeps moving, so what's hidden is that then it keeps becoming more exclusive for black and brown people in terms of admission policies, in terms of how those are oftentimes measured by standardized tests as opposed to interpersonal skills. And I know from growing up in my church experience, which was a relational experience, I think we build capital with each other as black and brown people with more of this dialogue, this circle. Not something that we intellectualize, but it's about this interpersonal relationship, and can we demonstrate our skills in some way to show college admissions officers that we have that kind of capacity to foster something that will bring something positive. Implicit biases on campus is another way this ordinary sort of racism shows up. The assumptions that people make without maybe verbalizing them. The expectations that faculty and sometimes administrators have, and sometimes other students have, when people of color are in the classrooms and or teaching. It's interesting, I think Dr. Fagin shared a story with me once just about how you'll be teaching a class and you'll have a student from the majority group who will come and say, I didn't expect that this class would be this rigorous, or I didn't expect this in this class. They'll probably put it in a nice way, but what they're saying is that the expectation of you is different than they might have had for a white faculty. And it goes both ways, even with white students, in some cases. Microaggressions. Another way this shows up. Language is one of the big purveyors of how microaggressions work. And I hear stories all the time that I like to incorporate in my work because I think that the lived experiences are just as much a part of this research as scholarly works and also case studies and so forth. And so I hear many, many stories where, like I had a student that just said to me, this is an African-American student, born here, didn't have any other marker that would identify him pretty much from being from anywhere else, and the professor said, what country are you from? From right down the block. I've had Asian students who say the same thing. And they get asked it really all the time. And before they open their mouths, especially, I had a student say, I was getting in the cab, and the cab driver was saying, well, what country are you from? And they were like, I was born here. So you see that microaggression works with language, with assumptions again. Sometimes even in terms of, we'll talk about intersectionality, but sometimes in terms of majorative language, which can be sometimes having to do with male hierarchies over female, like if it's a room and we have both women and men, majorative, a real quick example would be we say, hello guys, or how you doing guys? And it's a little embedded things that we don't see that's a majorative term where we're categorizing people in that way when we don't honor and respect it as females and so forth. Okay? Whiteness is property. So Chabernaugh, who's a researcher that looks into practices on college campuses, in 2009 she started doing a study about finding whether or not there were any incentives for faculty primarily to look at their curriculum, their syllabi, and change it so that it could become more inclusive, more culturally relevant, more culturally responsive, both race consciousness and using language and so forth in their syllabi. What she found was that they were decentralized because the system was resistant when they started seeing language embedded in faculty who agreed to participate in this to try to start change their curriculum. They start getting more questions from deans and administrators. Why are you talking about that? Or why are you focusing so much on this language or so much on this kind of teaching? And I must say again, as a black male faculty at MSU, in some of my evaluations, I once had an evaluation that said you'd be better off teaching critical race theory classes and not anything having to do. I was teaching it was a legal issues and administration class, but because I have a lens that brings this forward, people get uncomfortable. Both students and administrators in some cases. So she found this default to white. So because that's the safest place to go in return. We see this default to white happening in low numbers. Faculty administrators of color. We were just talking about that in the last session. So anywhere from 4 to below 4% is what you'll find for faculty, unless nationwide for administrators, presidents I'm talking about, provosts, vice presidents. And you find those mostly at HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, is where you'll find that particular. In terms of white universities, there's a study that came out, especially in the Ivies, it's literally all white at some of the more prestigious schools. So you see this default to white, or whiteness, as it's known in theory, come forward. And then we talked about this, the teaching practices is where you see it borne out over and over again. And so as a student, one of the ways that we say for students is to have that college story so that you can ask the questions about certain approaches in professors' courses who have their lens. And by the way, they don't have to be white to have whiteness as a lens. I'm going to put that out there. I'm just saying, right? Perpetuation of whiteness can happen from a person of any hue, because it's more safe to do so for many. Social construct of race. Hear this word a lot. Race is a social construction. We hear people say it all the time, but we often don't get into what foundations there are or that are existing as to why we say it is a social construction, especially for students. So when we say race is a social construction, it actually has a historical foundation that proves that to be the case. So first of all, we have to dispel the myth that there's any science behind it. Many of us have been taught at some point, and are still being taught in sort of ways, that there's some notion of some scientific evidence to support even little minor differences between human beings. But in fact, genetically, it's less than 0.01%. So then where did it come from? In order to really get at it, the key figure here is Blumenbach. Johann Blumenbach was a German botanist. And now, again, my time is short, but I have to get into some of this because it's really interesting if you think about this, because once we know better, we can do better with how we deal with this information in our lived experiences, right? Johann Blumenbach was this guy who studied skulls, and he traveled and looked at peoples and would look at, he built his work on Carolus Linnaeus, who was a French, medical and scientist. And so he thought, I'm going to sort of reclassify what Linnaeus did in a way and demonstrate that there is this notion of racial categorization, right? And so he had 5. He took the original 3 and he turned them into 5. And here's how he based it. Let's look at the categories first. So he said that the Caucasian race were whites. I mean, that's the skin color was white, but he called them Caucasian. And you'll see a very important and very interesting pattern here. The next one, Mongolian, which was a racial classification. Sometimes it was turned into Mongoloid to sound more scientific-y in my book, right? It said we're the yellow people, yellow race. Malayan, that was brown. American, he actually had a racial classification, American, and that was the red race. What do you think he had? And the elders in the room, like no, you can't answer this. But for the students, what do you think he called black folk?
She called black folk. I would say Negroes.
They went there after that, though. That wasn't too far. That wasn't too far removed from what he classified as that. But you notice the pattern, though. If you notice, these are all based on geography. The Caucasus region in Russia is where he got the word Caucasian from. Malayan, that's Malay. I mean, Malaysia is where he got brown. The Americas is where he got red. So here's where he said that Ethiopian was a black race, right? Now here is the systemic part, and to me, I say this, the diabolical part of this. It was an economic reason. In the Americas, they were trying to justify human slavery at the same time as this research was going on. They needed some science to justify the fact that they were enslaving people and treating them like animals. So in this classification, this is a hierarchy, and you can see it goes from white all the way down to who's at the bottom of this racialized hierarchy. And it's reason why, if you think about it, yeah, Asian Americans and Asian folk do have some things that happen that are systemically racist, but by and large, they don't get treated as horribly as black and brown folk do. He based this on this sense of skin color and this racialized hierarchy, right? So that's where this foundation comes from. So what I like to tell people when they start using too much of this kind of concept as if there's some separation, I say, be careful you haven't been Blumenbach. Be careful you haven't been Blumenbach.
Or Jeff Thomas Jefferson Bach.
There we go. Right. Right? Okay, so differential racialization. How does this show up on college campuses? Here's a couple of ways that I see it and that I've analyzed on our campus and other campuses. The images and symbols that we use. Isn't it really interesting? And I know, especially from when they do tours and they do admissions and they have pamphlets and brochures and websites and stuff that go out. It's interesting that you can see like black and brown people on the covers of the guides. There'll be a picture of crowds in the football game. They'll have a few spotted black and brown people. They'll have things up in the student unions, and we're looking happy. We're interacting with other students and stuff like that. And then, yet and still, we're not graduating. Those same people who are in pictures might be in that picture for that day, and then they're not even there the next semester. So it perpetuates this place where we're inclusive, we're diverse racially, ethnically, and we're welcoming on one side, but in actual practice, policy, we're being excluded. So that's one way basically this is a tenet that shows that they can use black and brown people to present a certain face or to promote their cause of diversity and to look that way on the surface. But when in reality, we're not there. Here's the biggest one. So, as a former football player, college athlete at MSU, I can't tell you how many guys that I played football with that did not graduate. But they were there, and we went to, they've done well recently, but we were the last team before this recent team that went to the national semifinals. People lauded that, and I can count maybe on this hand how many guys that I know that graduated, that I played with. And more than that. Then we had about a quarter to 30% of the team was black. And that happens all over the country. So it advances the cause of the institution athletically to have their sport team be competitive, but it doesn't advance our cause. So differential racialization is real. And this happens with a lot of different groups. One group it happens with, for instance, with Asian Americans, is they'll use that group because they'll say, well, academically, statistically, they do well. So if they can do well, so can you, right? But what they don't say is that they're only talking about really a specific Asian group. They're not talking about Southeast Asia, because those groups don't do well. They're talking about Korean, Japanese, and Chinese. They're not talking about Laos, Hmong. They're not talking about Southeast Asia. And again, it goes back to Blumenbach because you notice something about this. The darker the skin tone, even in Asian groups, the worse they do. It's all skin color. Intersectionality. This is a real complicated thing. So what this poses is that there's this intersection. When these things collide, it's really difficult for folks. Race, gender, class, and orientation. So you can be black, right? Female, poor, and gay, lesbian, right? If you intersect all of those things, you really oftentimes in lived experiences and even in data, you don't have a place where you feel like you belong. You can't align completely with one group or another because sometimes the disparities are caused by a specific thing. Let me give you an example. If you're black and female, just take those two, and you get passed over for promotion and or for scholarship and or whatever, and the persons who are making decisions, they might have a bias against black female. So when you go to try to complain and you make it a skin color issue, they say, what are you talking about? I have blacks that I promoted and they might be black men. I work well with blacks. If you go because of just the female thing, what are you talking about? Look at these women who I've advanced on. They might be white women or they might be Asian women. But they're not black women. So the intersectionality piece plays a huge role sometimes in figuring out, well, where can you speak truth to power if you don't have one position or the other? It almost requires us to then make this intersectionality its own category so we can say, this is why I'm complaining, because I'm black and I'm a female. Not one or the other. And this is also demonstrative of the fact that some people miss the struggle that we have in order to bring us to the table in terms of this, because they don't understand how if you disparage one group, you might also be disparaging the other group at the same time. Let me give you an example. How many people watch the Oscars? I mean, I'm into the music and arts thing, so I just, sometimes I don't watch because I enjoy it. I watch because I like to research how people in media and in entertainment, kind of handle themselves and also speak to some of these truths. How many people, you said you're watching, did you see the speech about women's rights and equal pay and so forth? Did you notice in that she was like, it's our time now, we fought for your, your rights, and we want you now to fight for ours. Did you notice how she worded that, right? And asked her to clarify later. And she was talking about how, for years, people of color, we fought for these rights and civil rights, and so it's our time now. What she was missing is that women are people of color. That's intersectionality. She missed that point. What she was then, so basically, what critical race theorists would say, and they have done it. If you go online, you will see all the rebuttals to that. It said, "Oh, she meant black women. She wants equal pay for white women." If you look at criminal or critical feminist theory, you'll see the same thing. There was a feminist movement that happened, and at first, black women were all on board with the feminist movement until they found out this is for white women. You ain't trying to advance our cause, because they didn't understand intersectionality. Okay? Diversity. How it plays out sometimes is in how we practice and how we teach diversity and how we do trainings. You ever notice how when something happens on campus or in an institution where there's an issue that arises, and it's probably more than likely either one having to do with race, gender, or ethnicity, but you'll have administrators say, we need more diversity training. What critical race theory will allow us to see is that those are different things. So you can't just do a diversity training when the problem is a racial one. You can't just process all of the problems that we have under this notion of what diversity is. We can have a room full of the same folk, the same skin color, and be just as diverse as if we had room with somebody from every different one of those skin tones. Because diversity is more about, again, the fact that in intersectionality, we might have people who belong to one of those groups or have identities within each one of those groups, even of the same racial groups. By the way, when I say racial groups, in this research, we have to define race as skin color in terms of how people are looking at it in terms of a lived experience. Sometimes ethnicity is a way to look at it too, but what I'm saying is that we don't get impacted because of those things more than we do skin color. Okay? And I'll give you a real quick anecdote to help you understand that. So, I like to boat. I live in Minnesota. I was born here. I like fishing. I like going on the lake. I had a brand new boat. So a couple years ago, my son and I had my brothers, I had about 6 black men on this boat. And we were boating on Lake Minnetonka, and while we were out here on this lake, I said you already caught what I'm saying, right? Everybody look around, Lake Minnetonka, right? And so we were boating, we were going through what's called a no-wake zone. You gotta go slow through a no-wake zone. And there's 2 boats in front of us, 1 boat behind us. And so when we got on the other end, everybody increased their speed to go off to their particular spot. We start to do our thing, and woo, woo, woo. And so Water Patrol stops us. You were speeding. And then, you know the rest, right? We get stopped. He makes up a whole bunch of things. He wants to look under the seats on our boat. We know why. We know what the deal is, right? So I'm asking him all along, you stopped us for speeding, but now you're looking under. So we were going through this whole thing, and it's part of the process. But what I discovered in terms of how it informs my work is I said, now, was that a cultural problem or was that a racial one? I could have been from anywhere, culturally or even ethnically. He didn't know any of that. He just know that black men didn't belong in that lake, no matter where you were from, no matter what ethnic. So that's why I say, for all practical purposes, even though race is a construct, it's the language we have. We need to understand it as skin color in this country, primarily in this country, because that's how we get impacted by it. Okay, critique of liberalism. Here's the biggest thing with this. It's the slow-moving process in decreasing any achievement in the gaps in any measurable ways, whether it be why we can't hire more black faculty or brown faculty, why we can't hire more black and brown administrators, why students are not admitted at rates that will sort of practice what we call more an equitable distribution. And liberals will all the times that we think that they have really good intentions, which sometimes they do, but it's through that slow-moving process and structural policies that impact why we see such a slow growth in achievement, why we see such a slow growth in economic decrease in wealth, and so forth. There's always this, like an excuse to say, well, you know, we're better than we used to be. But we just be patient. And King heard this. When King wrote Letter from a Birmingham Jail, that's exactly what they told him. Why are you going too fast? His letter from Birmingham basically responded to these eight white clergymen who said, you're going too fast. Just be patient. And he told them, well, if your people have been brutalized for 400 years, let's see how patient you will be. Right? So it's that slow-moving process. And again, it shows up in admission and hiring criteria. It's the language they embed in some of these processes to basically keep the system intact. And finally, it's this. They use equality against us. Because if it's fair and everybody has the same so to speak, opportunity, you should be able to, you know, it's fair. They do colorblind applications, supposedly. And I say that because you can look at a name sometimes, right? And we know that. We know there are studies where if you have a black or some kind of quote-unquote African-sounding name or something that's not John Smith, you don't even get called back. And there was a study just in Chicago that demonstrated that. This guy purposely did these names, and he was a Hispanic brother, and he did about 50 applications with Hispanic names and didn't get one call back. He changed his name, one letter, went from Jose to Joseph. And he got called by 10 companies the next day. Because they're practicing equality, but that on the surface, that's going back to that thing we talked about earlier in the tenets. It's normalization or differential racialization. They'll say it's open, but there are some embedded things that preclude us. So equity, though, is when you actually allocate resources and intentionality to actually reach out more to a certain demographic or group than you do to the other group. To give that balance more intentionality. So critical race theorists would say we got to look at equity. So how do we change? How do we look at going towards systemic change? One of the things that I have come across that we can do that is with telling our stories and being authentic, not being afraid to speak truth to power. Counter storytelling is a valuable tool because when you experience something and it shows up in a class that you're taking or in a club or on the campus, in any situation, this is from any point of view, whether you're faculty, administrator, student, staff, and something happens to you or you have an experience that people might perceive as being one thing, it's important for you to tell your story, your truth, and how it impacted you. So that I'll give you the same example for the young man who said the professor asked him where he was from when he was born right here. Encouraged him to go back and have a conversation, to tell a counter story how that was received in a room full of mostly white people. Can't just let it happen and then not deal with it. Counter stories. Tell your story in a way that makes them understand how it impacted you. We haven't been really successful with that. I remember for years, I wouldn't say it because there's so many of them, I forgot more things that happened to me than I remember sometimes. So you get tired of it. In fact, there's a book that just came back, it's called Racial Battle Fatigue. Right? You get so beat down when you say, it's not even worth it. I can't keep telling you, right? But what counter stories actually are suggesting is that we have to keep telling the truth. But we have to have some other things too. We have to look at what cultural relevancy is. And this is a practice primarily aimed at teachers and practitioners who look at ways of getting information to systems in terms of what it means to be culturally relevant. And it's not just having a bunch of people of different races and ethnicities in the room. It's actually being able to respond to those groups with the understanding that you can't be relevant culturally unless you're conscious racially. You cannot be relevant or responsive culturally until you're conscious racially. The race consciousness then becomes one where we have language that's embedded in all the things that we do, whether we're doing verbal or written communication, that has a consciousness around race or gender or class or all those other things that we talk about in terms of intersections. But we have to have process so that when we're communicating in any way, when we're doing our work, it's evident that we're conscious of this. And we can make other people conscious by our consciousness. And then intentional recruitment. So when I did this analysis of the ministry system, one of the things that I noticed is that in the written applications and in the advertisements that went out, the announcements for jobs, they go out to the same publications, the same news magazines, the same online sources, and so forth. Let me give you this one. This is a try this, or try to bring this to your university in terms of a strategy. How about you go to the churches and the mosques and the places of worship and in the communities where they actually sit and live and read? How about you send a representative to recruit in those situations and do it not in a written form, but ask to actually have some dialogue with families and with communities. Most people who are marginalized actually have what we call a collective process because they have to, because they're always battling white as property. So they come together. So their decisions a lot of times are together. Their processes, the way people think. And you have a better chance of recruiting if you go to those places to recruit students and even faculty. I hear people say, and I think we said this earlier, we're out there, right? But they won't go to like the churches and say and know that they don't believe that they're there. And like there's plenty of people who have higher education degrees in those settings. Or if they're not, they have family members who do. You know, I got a cousin in Texas who's been looking for it. You know, so when people come and recruit that way, you'd be surprised what you will find out. If you're on a hiring committee of any kind. So that recruitment has got to be intentional. And then the retention thing has to be set up so that you incentivize, and we have to understand how we can come together to challenge our institutions to create processes for us to do this. Cohort models has to be intentional, and they have to be intense in some cases. My research primarily focuses on black males, and I will tell you that when we do project-based learning processes with black males, and we're intentional about recruiting them and bringing them right away when they first come in the door with this process to get interest from them in terms of what's important to them, as well as to build social capital with understanding how the systems work as a group so that we don't isolate them. It works pretty well. It works pretty well. So retention strategies have to include a more collective idea. All right, so I just wanted to have some time for some questions and comments and any kind of things that we can help to explore where you might be with this. Yeah.
Okay, so, you know, on the study you talked about with how males are at a disadvantage, you know, since like first grade emotionally, I'm wondering, like, how are they studied and who has done this supposed research? Do you know, like, who's done this research? Like, where does it come from?
Okay, so that's a good question. Two places. Well, research, I mean, like I said, there are like Pedro Noguera. He has some stuff about black boys too, and other people of color, but he talks about these disparities in terms of you know, just identifying the sheer numbers of black boys, for instance, who are labeled, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the foundation of that system, though, it goes back to Brown versus Board.
Mm-hmm.
In Brown versus Board, the idea was that they would integrate, right, and that kind of thing. But almost what immediately followed Brown versus Board was federal funding of programs to identify, in quote unquote, on the surface, an attempt to help students who were behind by catching up. And then they, for instance, special education didn't exist before Brown versus Board. There was federal funding dollars that were put into special education. Tracking programs to see who, you know, ability grouping, supposedly. All those mechanisms were funded after Brown versus Board. So that was a part of the system to continue to perpetuate supremacy pretty much on one group's behalf, in a way. So the research that I'm talking about that looks at that basically analyzes those results and then basically points out that so now we have no representation because of it. Yes, sir, Professor.
Would you go a little further with the concept of whiteness as property, and then I have a suggestion? What is, I'm not clear on what that means. Whiteness as property.
Okay, thank you. So, in other words, so it's like an entitlement. In terms of structures, in terms of practices, in terms of cultural understandings. And so, in the United States, we have pretty much a structure that is predicated on pretty much one group. I mean, if you think about it, you want to distill it all the way down, it's white heterosexual males who have a basic power and influence in terms of how we do things. And so that property, what this theory sort of espouses is that a lot of what we do is geared towards perpetuating that. So it's like an entitlement. Now, I guess that's the way I would describe it more than the property. So it's like you're defaulting to that particular way of doing most anything. And I know, for instance, for me in music, right? I remember my undergraduate recital, I wanted to do a spiritual. I grew up in the black church. I wanted to do a gospel song. And they said, you can't get a music degree and do that when you're singing a recital. Because it had to be from a European sort of a tradition. So they defaulting to what white people like, and even aesthetically in some cases. So that's the property piece. So,
but you can put that in one of their hymn books, what you wanted to do. It's, you know, from a wide frame of reference. You know, you see many, in many white churches where you see black music in the church, but it's not honored or recognized as such. The other point I want to make, and I'm going to have an argument with some theorists, because sometimes we get paralysis from analysis sometimes. Too much analysis. When I say racism, I mean white supremacy. I don't mean anything else. Because there's no other way to explain it to me. So we're kind of confused about that. I've heard black people think they're racist because they fight racism. That's confusing. Race, you alluded to, was Blumenbach and de Compto and all those guys who invented race. You know, Europeans, the people never heard of them. White people never heard of them. How Europeans invented the construct of race. The intelligentsia of Europe, mainly French, German, and Englishmen, created these classifications. All classifications come from the doctrine of white supremacy. If a person says he's a mulatto, he's octoroon, a quadroon, a mestizo, zambos, all of them, a definition, fall under white supremacy. There's only one form of racism that matters in the world. I don't care about China right now. As this stuff that happened after Columbus got lost. And it didn't happen all at once. You were saying these things were happening simultaneously. The discoveries, the colonialism, imperialism. At the same time, these ideas about whites being superior and manifest destiny and city on the hill, all these are white supremacist things. Even American exceptionalism is a form of white supremacy. That the world is my idea. One guy said that, Schopenhauer. The world is what white people say it is. and white people have been calling themselves white that long. That happened after the explorations. The average white person are not clear on what Caucasian means. He was talking about a specific group of people in a geographic region called Caucasus. And they tend to be fair-skinned and blonde-headed and blue-eyed. And he said they were the most beautiful people in the world. All of a sudden, everybody wants to be Caucasian. You know? And that's what a lot of white people not clear on what that means. That's what James Baldwin meant when he says white people, as in white Americans, don't know who they are. They really don't. They just accept being white. That's the price of the ticket. Give up your real identity and be white. So,
I want to get to this. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I went to your question and I got to that.
Last year I went to Dr. Umar Johnson's session he had here in Minnesota, and he was talking about ADHD and black men being diagnosed, and as well as black kids, well, little girls as well. And he's saying that it's happening in our education system because the teachers can't deal with the students. They don't know how to deal with black men. And sometimes, you know, the younger black girls, are, you know, they're a little wild too, but a lot of the guys, they have a lot of energy, so they're out of ADHD. And I'm just wondering, like, what can we do to try to help the parents stop letting these people diagnose their kids with these mental illnesses when there's really nothing wrong with them? They just need to run around the track a few times and get the energy out of them and maybe stop taking so much sugar into their system. How can we as leaders help this problem decrease? Because I've seen like my little cousins be diagnosed and there's nothing wrong, they're smart kids. And because of this ADHD stuff, they're starting to get trapped in the criminal justice system.
Right.
They're not graduating,
That's right.
they're not going to college, and then next thing you know, they're just sitting on the street doing nothing with their lives. So it needs to stop. And as a person that wants to help people, I need to know some of the steps I should be able to take to try to stop this from happening to our young men and women.
Yep, thank you. Very good question, and I appreciate that dilemma, because it's a dilemma because systems will be wanting to do one thing, and then you have your own lived experiences tell you another thing. I don't know how many other black men in the room would say this, but I know they want to do the same thing with me. But here's how my mom said it. No.
Yep.
She said, no. You can tell your parents to say, no, we're not labeling. Now, here's the thing. So, this goes back, and again, I appreciate that illumination too, Professor Fati, because here's the thing. We have this historical supremacy effort and perpetuation has been this. And one of the things that you will know is this. So let's go back to Brown again. This is a school-related thing. What we don't see is that after Brown versus Board, what happened to the black teachers? And the black principals and the black school
coaches.
administrators
Black coaches.
and the coaches and the music teachers? They didn't come along. They weren't busting those positions. I know plenty of people in my own family history and lineage where educators became janitors and bus drivers, the help, right? So it's no wonder that even today I was asked, or told actually, someone walked up to me who was trying to find some, said, oh, you must be security. No wonder. It's like we don't belong, right? But that's where it comes from. So those black women primarily, again, we talk, had a role that was esteemed in the black community for educating our children, and that didn't happen. So now you have a situation where they don't. You're right. They don't have a mechanism. They don't understand it. So first of all, they need to be told no. Secondly, you've got to encourage people to have processes where they can come to and organize efforts to go to the schools and speak their truth. And tell them what you do at home. Tell them what they do at home. This is how we interact with behavioral issues. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Right, yeah. Oh, she's first. I'm sorry, because I'm trying to go in order.
So you talked about systematic racism in schools.
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
I said you talked about systematic racism in schools, K through 12. So, all the people in this room are going to college and, quote unquote, have made it past systematic racism. How have you noticed that that still affects how people see themselves in a college setting,
Right.
and like courses and things like that?
Oh,
as
for
a
sure.
college professor?
Oh, yeah. So my thing was that the foundation's in K-12, but my whole point in doing this is that it just matriculates to where we are, and even worse in some cases, because now you have a thing called quote-unquote academic freedom, where professors can do anything they want and say, well, no, it's up to you. Now, it's nothing wrong with my teaching. You need to do a better job. And they don't have a relationship with you. So I see it playing out in the expectations that people have. Like I said, when you ask somebody where they're from and you don't even know who they are, you done already set your expectations so low. How do you expect the student to be successful when now they don't even trust you, right? So it happens there. it happens in how people will say that they want to have you achieve a certain level, but then have policies that impact that. And then when you get angry enough at it, and show any kind of demonstrative way, in any kind of demonstrative way, then you become the angry black person, or the student. That all those students are select. So I see it playing out. Let me point out one other thing that's important to understand. You know, when I do this audience, I try to understand that, you know, we need to illuminate some things, and depending on your racialized experience, you might have a certain reaction to some of this work. I do want to say, and it's important for us to realize this too, as black and brown folk, and even in the white folk in the room to understand. When I'm in a room full of white folk, I always tell them, I'm not here to say that you're the, you know, the reason for the entire downfall of human beings. You know, because I mean, if you look at it, there actually has been historically even what we call white allies. There have been. If you look up a thing in 1838ish or so, look at the American Indian Removal Act, you will see there were white allies to our Native brothers and sisters who spoke truth to power even then. So we've had that. So understand that. And so the other thing I would suggest, again, even following up with your question, is find who those white allies are, who get it, who understand their place of privilege, but know how to use it in a way that helps practice equity. That's another way you can think about it. And so on college campuses, we have the same thing that goes on. So it's like when we get on a campus, we have to build that social capital and know where we can go to find those allies to speak truth to power against their own colleagues. Because there are some that actually exist. If you're on MSU's campus, I can tell you right now, in my department, we have a whole bunch. We do it because we bring it to the table. We don't leave anything off. We talk and we're intentional. So, but you have to find in your situation, in your departments, and on your campus. If you're on our campus, come see me. We can help. Yeah, you were next.
Yeah, basically what we understand the church should mention about her question based on smart for the people that they had something something like it's gonna happen to me like when I first came from Liberia. 2008, I went to Pakistan high school, and said it my mom, like, she basically used to listen to what people say about me. She got me cry and say, oh, they say you last time you have maybe this all of her own funny people used to tell her that because when we go to like from the occasion, just I just like to have 4 days like that. That's who I am. So they can basically that's what she used to believe. She even wanted to take me to the psychiatrist who I thought say I am not going. I don't say that I am not going because I know like did that inside me there's nothing wrong with me.
Okay.
So it came after like where she went to my school parents and teacher conference, and then one of them teacher told her that they will wear your son came dressed. If he didn't tell me that he just came to this country, I would never know because he dressed so professional in the way in which he dressed. So we were going like sometimes we should be so depressed. So just there because my mom came to this country like 2001 when I was like 11 years old. We were away for like 8 years.